Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's program. On today's program, we're continuing with our new series on the analysis of motion segment integrity and spinal impairments due to loss of motion segment integrity. And let's just review where we've come from so far in order to put today's program into proper perspective. We began in our first session of this program by talking about what the AMA guides have to say about spinal impairments, and specifically about loss of motion segment integrity as one of the spinal impairments. And the AMA guides describe loss of motion segment integrity of the spine as a major and significant impairment of the spine, representative of great loss of function of the spine, regardless of the segment of the spine being considered. It qualifies for much higher levels of permanent impairment than can possibly be achieved through use of the range of motion method or the lower categories of the DRE methods. Because, and the reason that is because loss of motion segment integrity represents a great loss of function in all of its components of the spine. It represents loss of strength of the spine. It represents loss of motion of the spine. It represents all of the neurologic compromise that could accompany a spinal injury. It considers that this condition is easily aggravated from activities of work and daily living that would otherwise be inconsequential. And so really, permanent impairment due to loss of motion segment integrity is the big dog of the spinal impairments. So we spent some time reviewing how to make the measurements on both lumbar and cervical spine cases. And we discussed some actual cases, one involving the cervical spine and one involving the lumbar spine. And I shared with you some sample or example permanent impairments related to both of those conditions, a cervical spine injury and a lumbar spine injury. And we also went over the apportionment argument in both of those cases. So those were just examples, and your analysis could come up differently, but the examples that I shared with you are simply illustrative of the many creative ways that you can interpret the analysis of motion segment integrity to come up with your opinions and conclusions related to permanent impairment, and then also related to the apportionment of any permanent impairment that you provide. Now, in today's session, I want to share with you an interesting analysis that involves an anomalous condition in the cervical spine. And let me preface this by saying that many times when you do the analysis of motion segment integrity, when you find loss of motion segment integrity, that's frequently due to an anomalous condition of the spine. And that can include, for example, in today's case, we're going to talk about cervical rib. Could involve a block vertebra, could involve a transitional vertebra, could involve a spina bifida, could involve a lumbosacral transitional vertebra. In other words, there are many spinal anomalies that interfere with normal intersegmental motion of the vertebrae. So there are times when you do the analysis, you're going to find that due to the pre-existing condition of an anomalous configuration of the spine, there is subsequent loss of motion segment integrity of that spinal segment. Well, the question then becomes, does that contribute to impairment? And is that impairment in any way related to the industrial injury? Well, in today's example regarding cervical rib, we had a 50-year-old female who was involved in doing an inspection, a white-collar file inspection at a elementary school. And she was walking down the hall of the elementary school when she slipped and fell on some flooring that had just recently been mopped. So she came upon some floor that was inadvertently wet. She didn't realize that it was wet. So she slipped and fell and came down on her right shoulder, her right thoracic spine. She jarred her neck, jarred her shoulder, jarred her upper extremity. And she continued to complain of headaches, neck pain, thoracic spine pain, and shoulder pain. Well, no one ever took x-rays of the cervical spine, until my evaluation. I was the first to obtain x-rays of the cervical spine, and indeed the x-rays of the cervical spine demonstrate the existence or the pre-existence of an anomalous cervical spine in the form of a cervical rib. So let's go through the analysis of motion segment integrity, and I'll share with you how these findings contributed to my opinions and conclusions in this case. Okay, so here we are, we're at the x-rays, and let's just begin at the beginning with these x-rays. And let's start with the AP cervical spine x-ray. And you'll notice that this is our third set of x-rays that we've looked at in this case. And you'll notice that these x-rays come with a completely different software package than we've seen before. But as I said again, they're all about the same. And they contain the basic tools that we need as qualified medical evaluators to do our analysis. So here we are at the AP cervical, and here's our C7 vertebrae here, and you'll notice that the transverse process on the right extends beyond the transverse process of the vertebrae below, so that qualifies as an elongated transverse process on the right. But notice here on the left, this extended transverse process also curls around and takes the form of configuration of a cervical rib. So interesting, when I received the radiologist report regarding these x-ray studies, the radiologist failed to describe the existence of a cervical rib. So I then called the medical radiologist up and asked him if in his opinion, did he identify a cervical rib on these x-rays, and he admitted that indeed he did consider that to be a cervical rib. For whatever reason, he neglected to mention it on his initial report, and this brings up a principle. If you yourself have findings that the medical radiologist does not describe, and you need an opinion on those findings, don't hesitate to call them back up. They're always willing to take your call, and they're always good-natured, and they're always willing to provide an addendum to their initial report if that is appropriate and applicable. So this shows the cervical rib in clear form. It shows that it's large. It shows that it circles around. There may or may not be an articulation here in this region. There may or may not. So this could simply represent an elongation of the transverse process with associated fibrous bands, or it could represent a true cervical rib. So let's take a look at some couple other images. This is an oblique image here, and again shows a large cervical rib, curvilinear cervical rib right here. Okay, much larger than that on the other side, which is right here, and extends apparently around in the exact configuration that you would expect of a cervical rib. Now these may represent fibrous bands right here in this region, but the point is that they're clearly delineated on these x-rays. Here's the oblique image on the other side. Let's blow this up, and again it shows that curvilinearity here of that cervical rib right here. Let's see if we have depiction of it on any other images. This is the lateral view. This is important for our discussion in that the lateral view, as you can see, shows some pre-existing degenerative change with some anterior osteophytosis here at C5, C6. There is loss of the normal cervical lordosis. We call this a military configuration of the neck. And we don't quite see the cervical rib here in this image. But take a look at that cervical lordosis, or the lack of that cervical lordosis. You could actually say that there's some reversal of the cervical lordosis. So Obviously, this is a diseased neck that's symptomatic and has the presence of at least degenerative change as a pre-existing condition, and also an anomalous configuration in the form of a cervical rib. So with the flexion and extension images, here's the flexion image, and you'll notice that the range of motion in flexion is somewhat limited. And the extension image, which is this one here. No, that's the neutral. Here's the extension image. You'll notice the range of motion is limited. Well, we're not going to go through the measurement process except to remind you that when making your measurements in the cervical spine, we draw a line through the anterior to posterior tubercles of the atlas, and then we draw our lines across the inferior end plates. Oops. Let's do that again. We begin by drawing our line. Oops, what's happening here with my angles? I'm sorry. Let's start over. We begin by drawing a line through the anterior and posterior tubercles of C1, and then across the inferior end plates of the cervical spine vertebrae. So that gives us an angle here of 33, and I'm not going to reproduce the lines in the interest of time, but we'll simply go to the measurements here in the Diagnostic Studies section of our report. So I mentioned here, again, my key phrase: in order to obtain her current condition, I referred her to a local facility for updated x-rays. Those were completed on such and such date, and the report of findings as described by Hanks, MD, of ABC Imaging included, here's his findings, and here's his impression. And you'll notice in these findings, he does mention anterior osteophytosis as a pre-existing degenerative change of the cervical spine. There is no mention of the presence of a cervical rib, and so on that basis, I called him up, asked him for an addendum, and he provided me with the following addendum. Following clinical consultation with Dr. Carpenter, a review demonstrates small rudimentary cervical ribs. So now we have a medical radiologist's opinion for the presence of cervical ribs. Then I provide my own interpretation of the studies below. Here I mention that there is presence of a cervical rib. And then when we go to our analysis of motion segment integrity, I state that range of motion is somewhat reduced, although the cervical lordosis reverses normally. And on the extension cervical, there's no evidence for ligamentous instability. But in both cases, I refer the reader to the analysis of motion segment integrity below. So let's just go to that. I found that between C1 and C2, there was 18.1 degrees of total angular motion. And remember from our reference of the AMA guides, it says that in the upper cervical spine, there is little flexion and extension, while the lower cervical spine permits increasing flexion extension movements from about 10 degrees at C2 to C3 to 20 degrees at the lower levels. So at C2, C3, I found indeed about 9.6 degrees of total angular motion, and that's consistent with what the AMA guides describe as 10 degrees. Okay, so I found that to be normal angular motion. Well, at C3, C4, where we would expect somewhere between 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 degrees, we were able to identify only 8.2 degrees. So I described that as decreased intersegmental motion. At C4, C5, we had 12.7. I consider that to be normal. At C5, C6, we had 9.2 degrees. I considered that to be decreased. And then at C6, C7, we had only 3.7 degrees. Again, I considered that also to be decreased because the guides tell us that down in these lower cervical segments, we could expect normally about 20 degrees of total angular motion. So according to this description from the AMA guides, Mrs. Adams has loss of motion segment integrity due to decreased intersegmental motion at C3, C4, C5, C6, and C6, C7. And then I provided the reader with some medical research here regarding cervical rib in order to relate the cervical rib to Mrs. Adams' current symptoms and her current condition. And the final conclusions of the diagnostic studies as relates to the cervical spine is that the cervical spine is significant for pre-existing degenerative change, mostly at the lower cervical C5, C6 level. This, combined with anomalous cervical rib, causes reversal of the normal cervical lordosis, and I should say, and also a loss of motion segment integrity at multiple levels of the cervical spine. So doctors, what's the significance of this? Well, you may have your own opinion as to the significance or the lack of significance of these findings. But in my opinion, the presence of the cervical rib, the anomalous development of the cervical rib, is at least contributing to Mrs. Adams' ongoing report of symptoms with the cervical spine. And the cervical rib is at least contributing to multiple levels of loss of motion segment integrity, in other words, decreased intersegmental motion of the cervical spine. And we can verify that through our measurements, which show 3 levels. The bottom 2 levels, one of which has the cervical rib attached to it, and then 1 normal level, and then again 1 level that shows decreased intersegmental motion. So multiple levels of diminished motion of the spinal segments of the cervical spine. Up until now, this had not been identified. Even the cervical rib had not been identified, and the degenerative change of the cervical spine had not been identified because no one took the time to investigate her report of ongoing symptoms of headaches, neck pain, stiffness, muscle hypertonicity of the cervical spine. No one investigated these with diagnostic studies. And look at how much information the diagnostic studies reveal to us that can be obtained no other way. We cannot determine this information through physical examination alone. So it was my opinion that based on the findings of these cervical spine x-rays, that she had not received appropriate or adequate medical treatment up until this point in time. In other words, this is a cervical spine condition that, in my opinion, required formal physical therapy and or formal chiropractic treatment, with chiropractic being the preferred treatment modality for this type of a cervical spine condition. So based on this new information, I was able to provide a non-permanent and stationary status opinion for an examinee who had already been declared to be permanent and stationary without any permanent impairment. Well, what a great service this turned out to be for this examinee, who was reporting to her providers ongoing symptoms and activity limitations, but was reporting those problems to deaf ears because the medical providers felt that there was no ongoing condition that could possibly be symptomatic, and new x-ray studies reveal the exact opposite. So what a great service this was for this examinee, who is now, to the best of my knowledge, is now pursuing treatment directed at this symptomatic cervical spine. Now, when this examinee is determined to be permanent and stationary, If she has ongoing symptoms and ongoing objective findings with the cervical spine, it's possible that she could have permanent impairment, and it's possible that that permanent impairment could include some percentage of impairment for a loss of motion segment integrity of the cervical spine. So I want to use this case to illustrate to you the principle that I've been iterating and reiterating throughout this series, and that is, in my opinion, the flexion and extension studies must be taken on every single spinal case. Every case that involves a spinal injury, we have an obligation to assess for the presence or absence of loss of motion segment integrity. In other words, our job is to assess our examinees for the presence or absence of the permanent impairments that are described in Chapter 15 of the AMA Guides. One of the most profound impairments that are described in Chapter 15 are the impairments due to loss of function of the individual spinal segments of the cervical spine, the thoracic spine, of the lumbar spine, and many doctors are not doing this analysis and are doing a great disservice to the examinees. So I want to encourage you to adopt this procedure and to work over the initial bumps and grinds and boulders and barriers and obstacles that will try to confound you in attempting to actually obtain the diagnostic images on your desktop. There are many obstacles, and we've talked about those, but if you persist and get this procedure systematized and templated, you'll have it mastered, and you'll be able to obtain the images as necessary, and you'll be able to do the analysis, and you'll be able to make sophisticated recommendations and sophisticated opinions and conclusions based on information that other doctors are simply pretending does not exist. And many doctors are simply just overlooking this procedure, which is a great disservice in my opinion. So I hope these words of encouragement help uplift you and show you the many possible uses and the many possible applications for this analysis. So again, I want to encourage you to adopt this procedure with each and every spinal case. Okay, doctors? So I hope that helps you. For now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's video. Look forward to being with you on future videos. And for now, I'm wishing you best of success as a qualified medical evaluator.